It's sometime during 1996. In North Korea, a 9-year-old boy named Timothy Cho has come home from school to find his life turned upside down. His house is empty and his parents are gone. On the dinner table lies a single note. It's addressed to him and it explains everything. His mother and father have fled the country. They crossed the Chinese border just 100 meters from their home, and they're never coming back. In North Korea, fleeing is considered treason, and treason is punishable by death. This means that in one day, Timothy has gone from being a normal middle-class kid to the son of traitors, and from this moment on, his life will never be the same. He'll be shunned by his friends, his teachers, and society at large. He'll spend years of his childhood in abject poverty, living on the streets and surviving off of whatever scraps of food he can find. And then one day, just like his parents, Cho would risk everything to try and escape North Korea. He'll face prison, torture, betrayal. He'll come inches from death, and he'll be saved by moments of unbelievable luck. This is the incredible true story of how Timothy Cho escaped the world's most secretive and oppressive regime. Not once, but twice. And what he learned about freedom along the way. Timothy Cho was born in a small town in North Korea. Both his parents were high school teachers, which is a respected job in the country. And at home, life was peaceful, happy, and loving. As a kid, Timothy spent his days watching TV and swimming in the river near his house with his friends. What he didn't realise, however, was that the TV only showed government propaganda about the nation's leader, Kim Jong-il, and that the river he loved so much, the Tumen, wasn't just any river. It actually marks the border with China. While Timothy was outside playing, his parents were whispering behind closed doors, secretly planning their escape across that same river. Though it may not have been clear to someone so young, Timothy was growing up in the mid-1990s, one of the darkest periods in North Korea's history. The country was going through what the government called the Arduous March, a devastating famine that killed up to 1 million people. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, North Korea lost its biggest trading partner. Its economy fell apart, and a series of natural disasters only made things worse. People went days without food, sometimes even without water. Entire families starved to death. The regime continued to pour hundreds of millions into its nuclear weapons program, while ordinary people did whatever they could to survive. For some, this meant scavenging, trading, or begging for food. For others, like Timothy's parents, the only option was to run. Years later, in interviews, Cho said, "My parents could not take me with them. It was a very tough, heavy decision they had to make." Cho either doesn't really know or hasn't revealed the full reasons for his parents leaving without him, but when they left, his life completely fell apart. Overnight, he joined North Korea's hostile class. He was the son of traitors. His teachers whispered about him behind his back. His classmates glared at him in hatred. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. One day during a school break, he just ran away and never came back. Still just a kid, Timothy joined the ranks of North Korea's homeless children, the Kotjebi. These kids lived under bridges, in train stations, or anywhere they could find shelter, and survived off of scraps of food. Every morning, Timothy would wake up to see city council workers collecting the bodies of homeless children who died during the night. He tried to find help from relatives, but they turned him away too. During the famine, food was so scarce that people refused to share, even with family. Eventually, though, Cho's grandma did take him in, and together they worked a small plot of land in the mountains. He woke up at 6:30 every morning, walked for hours to the allotment, and didn't return home until after dark. In an interview years later, Cho said, "I asked my grandmother so many times, 'Why are my parents gone?' She was crying with me. I didn't understand at that time." No matter how hard he worked, though, North Korea would never let Timothy live a normal life. He couldn't go back to school, he couldn't get a job. Even when he tried to enlist in the army, they rejected him, all because his parents were defectors. Instead, they offered to send him to a coal mine, which was basically a death sentence. Cho later told in interviews, "This was the worst environment. A cave, a coal mine, You literally have to crawl inside and dig coals out, and often mines collapsed, and many young boys and girls were killed or even lost their arms or legs. That was it. He realized he had no future. His country had abandoned him, and his only option left was to escape. Finally, Timothy understood his parents. Very few people ever manage to escape North Korea. There are only 3 routes out. You can hop and skip over the 2 million landmines buried along the DMZ towards South Korea, clamber over the mountains into Russia, or cross the river into China. Only around 35,000 people have ever officially made it out of the country. Many more have been caught and sent back to prison camps, tortured or killed. Most are never heard from again. But for 17-year-old Timothy Cho, staying behind in North Korea meant certain death. So in 2004, he joined a small group of people trying to flee. Their plan was to cross the river into China, then make their way through the wilderness to Mongolia, a country that offered a diplomatic route to South Korea, where they could finally seek asylum. They crept out in the dead of night, crossed the same river Timothy had loved so much as a child, and moved like shadows. They knew that if they were discovered, they could be shot on sight. But somehow, they did actually make it. They were in China, and for the first time, Timothy witnessed the spectacle of freedom. His eyes were lit up by flashing lights and colours. He was surrounded by people with clothes and hairstyles he'd never seen before. He could hear music flowing through the air and smell the aroma of exotic foods overflowing on the market stalls. People were happy, healthy, and the world they lived in was so much more exciting than Cho could have ever imagined. And that's when it struck him. Everything he'd ever been told about North Korea was fiction. But now wasn't the time to stop and smell the roses. To reach true freedom, the group still had to cross one more border, into Mongolia. The group set out across China, travelling for days through unforgiving terrain, and finally they reached the edge. The Mongolian border was right in front of them, and everything went wrong. Just as they were about to cross, they were ambushed by Chinese security forces. In seconds, the group, some of which were just children, started running, but there was nowhere to go. Cho later told interviewers, "Chinese military guards were chasing us and wanted us to stop. We were just all scattered. We didn't know which way the border was, and when we didn't stop running, they started shooting our way. You could see bullets coming next to your feet. The children were running, holding hands, and screaming." You see, under a 1986 border agreement with Pyongyang, China often sends North Korean escapees back home, fully aware that many will face torture, imprisonment, or execution. There's even a cash reward system. Chinese citizens can be paid for reporting North Korean defectors. To the Chinese government, North Korean escapees are illegal economic migrants, and as such, Cho and the group were tied up by their hands and legs and thrown into a prison cell. It was all over. After getting so close to freedom, the group was being shipped back to North Korea. And that's where the nightmare really began. Timothy was crammed into a filthy prison cell with 50 other people. They were given numbers instead of names. They slept upright, leaning on each other's backs, and if they were lucky, they got 2 watery scoops of cornmeal a day. Otherwise, inmates caught and ate rats and snakes just to survive. Sometimes a prisoner would be hauled out of the cell by guards. At night, the other inmates would hear them being beaten from another room, screaming and begging for mercy. Then, one morning, Timothy woke to a scene he'd never forget. A man in his cell had died overnight. The guards stormed in, grabbed the body by the arms, and dragged it out like a dead animal. Nobody said a word. As the days passed by, Cho was interrogated relentlessly. The authorities demanded to know whether any Westerners had helped him escape. In later interviews, Timothy explained why. He said that, quote, "North Korea is paralyzed against those groups who tried to help them get out of China, because the more people get out, the more stories come out. Then what's happening inside the country must be revealed. They're scared of that. They know that's going to induce the end of the regime." And it can't be overstated here, the North Korean prison system is one of the most brutal in the world. The United Nations has described it as a crime against humanity, while Amnesty International has compared it to Nazi-era concentration camps. A UN report from 2014 estimated that around 200,000 people, including children, may have been victims of enforced disappearance after being sent back to North Korea from other countries. The report says that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea systematically employs violence and punishments that amount to gross human rights violations in order to create a climate of fear. Hundreds of thousands of political prisoners, it adds, have likely died in these camps over the past 5 decades. And very little has changed over the years. If anything, according to a UN report this year, things might have actually gotten worse. Inside these camps, prisoners are starved, beaten and tortured, often for crimes as small as watching South Korean dramas or listening to K-pop. Inmates who actually survive North Korea's prison system describe some pretty horrific things. Some, like former prisoner Shin Dong-hyuk, saw their own mothers executed before their eyes. Others were forced to hang by their arms, to crouch on the floor for hours, or to jump until their legs gave out. Many fall victim to SA, forced abortions, and long days of back-breaking work. One woman, only identified as prisoner 42, was arrested around the same time as Timothy Cho for fleeing North Korea. She was forced to officially divorce her husband and was then assaulted every day for a year during her interrogations, forced to crawl around on all fours while completely exposed. Timothy, in one sense, was lucky. After months of starvation, beatings, and interrogation, he was released. He still doesn't know exactly why, but he suspects that it was because he was still a minor in the eyes of the law. But that didn't mean that he escaped unscathed. By the time Timothy reached his grandmother's house, his only safe haven, he couldn't walk properly, and he couldn't even sit down. Cho later said in an interview, "I still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. The images of screaming and anguish continue to haunt me. North Korea has the most creative torture systems in the world. So many acts of inhumanity would happen before my eyes, but I am grateful to God that I somehow managed to get free." Timothy was reeling from his imprisonment. He was bruised, weak, traumatized, and still living under constant surveillance. But he had glimpsed freedom, and he knew he couldn't survive in North Korea. So he made a decision. He would try again. This time, the plan was different and even more dangerous. Instead of heading for Mongolia, Timothy would travel across China all the way to Shanghai. His goal was to reach the Shanghai American School, which of course had international ties, where he thought the Chinese authorities would struggle to get to him. And so, in 2006, at 19 years old, Timothy Cho joined another small group of escapees to sneak across the Tumen River. Together, they forged fake IDs and began a nerve-wracking journey across China, covering over 1,200 miles and dozens of checkpoints. Every bus ride and train stop could have been their last. Yet somehow, against all odds, they made it to Shanghai, one of the largest, most dazzling cities in the world. To Timothy, it must have felt like stepping onto another planet. For a second time, no less. In 2007, after months of running and hiding, the group finally reached their destination, the Shanghai American School. For a brief, electric moment, the future looked bright. Maybe this was it. Maybe freedom was only a few steps away. But there was one last hurdle. To reach the school grounds, they had to climb the fence. They chose lunchtime, thinking the commotion of children outside would disguise their entry, and one by one they signalled to each other and started hauling themselves over the fence, clutching notes that explained who they were and why they had come. But instead of a commotion, the children just gathered on the playground, watching in stunned silence as the group of strangers clambered into their schoolyard. The staff had never faced anything like this before. The principal came out, listened to the group's pleas, and promised to call the US Embassy in Beijing. When he returned, however, the news was devastating. The school wasn't a diplomatic centre, he explained. It couldn't offer protection, and instead, he'd called the Chinese police. The group's worst fears had come true, and within minutes, dozens of officers surrounded the building. But the escapees refused to go quietly. They linked arms, forming a human chain on the floor, hoping that if they held their ground, someone would intervene. Instead, the police dragged them across the ground and into waiting vans, beating the women and yanking their hair as horrified schoolchildren cried and teachers watched on. The group was thrown into Shanghai police station, and Timothy, at least, believed it was finally the end. Many North Korean defectors travel with a suicide plan in mind. They'd rather die by their own hand than be dragged back to the regime where they'd likely be tortured and killed. Timothy was no different. He'd hidden a stash of sleeping pills in his pocket for this exact moment. In the police station bathroom, he swallowed as many as he could and washed them down with toilet water. Fate, however, had other plans. Hours later, Timothy woke up disoriented, weak, but still alive, in the same grim prison cell. He later told interviewers, "I knew if the Chinese sent me back, I'd die in prison or be executed in public. I decided I'd rather die by my own hand, so I swallowed as many sleeping pills as I could get. But instead of killing me, those sleeping pills gave me a very good night's sleep." Once again, Timothy Cha was behind bars, this time in China. Once again, he'd lost hope. He would soon be deported to North Korea, where this time he'd almost certainly face execution or worse. But this time, he found the strength to carry on in an unlikely figure. One of his cellmates, a former South Korean gangster, had found religion. This man gave Timothy a Bible and told him to pray. Cha obeyed. Every night he read the Bible, or just held it in his hands and prayed desperately for his safety. Meanwhile, something incredible was happening outside the prison walls. Hundreds of children at the Shanghai American School had seen Cha's group being arrested. One 13-year-old student in particular was deeply affected by what she saw, and she reached out to a reporter via email. Even in broken English, her message caught the reporter's attention, and it led to a chain reaction. While Cha was quietly praying in prison, news of the Shanghai 9, the 9 North Korean refugees held in China, began to spread. Their case was making headlines, and people were paying attention. Major international media outlets, including CNN, The Washington Post, and the BBC, picked up the story. Human rights groups joined in too. Soon, protesters were gathering outside Chinese embassies around the world, demanding that the escapees not be sent back to North Korea, where their fate would have been death. And this pressure worked. After weeks of global outcry, the Chinese government made a very unusual decision. Instead of sending Timothy and the others back to North Korea, they would be deported to the Philippines. From there, Timothy travelled from Manila to Seoul, then onward to the United Kingdom. He couldn't believe it. He cheated death twice, and he was finally free. After settling in Britain, Timothy learned English, took on higher education, and decided to share his story, hoping to shine a light on those still locked in North Korean gulags. His interviews and presentations over the years have revealed just how horrific life is for ordinary people in the country, which ranks as one of the most oppressive countries in the world year on year. Cha often tells reporters how growing up, he believed he lived in the most perfect nation on earth, one ruled by divine leaders. In North Korea, every home, every school, and every street corner is a shrine to the Kim family. From the moment children can speak, they're taught that Kim Il-sung, the country's founder, is an eternal, godlike leader, and that his grandson, the now leader Kim Jong-un, is literally descended from God. Life there is tightly controlled in almost every way. Ordinary citizens can't make international calls, and local phones are restricted too. There's no internet like YouTube, Facebook, or Zoom. Jeans are banned for being too American, and even people's hairstyles must be state approved. Freedom of movement doesn't really exist. Every trip requires a government permit. All TV channels broadcast Kim fan propaganda 24/7, and passports are nearly impossible to get. Executions are a part of public life too. The victims are often defectors, just like Cha, who are caught trying to escape the regime. When Timothy was just 11, he was actually forced to witness one execution himself. The children were told to sit in the front row and watch as bullets ripped the man's body apart in front of them. For most North Koreans, the country itself is more like a prison. Cha had said in an interview, quote, "What I remember of my experience of living in this totalitarian regime was that I didn't know who I was, what choice I had, what I loved. and what my dream was. The past years of my life in democracy have helped me to discover who I am, what I love and care about, and what I stand for. Our intrinsic, democratic, constitutional values of freedom of faith, expression, speech, and opportunity. Despite how terrifying North Korea sounds, it still manages to attract tens of thousands of tourists every year. Some, unlike Timothy Cho, don't survive their visit. And if you'd like to know just how bad things can get, you should check out our video on Otto Vambia, the man who did not survive North Korea.